A gangster walked into a hunting club and fired his gun into the air to scare the people inside. The people inside were hunters. They had been hunting since before he was born. They had weapons older than his father, and not one of them looked up from what they were doing. He thought that was a weakness. It was the last mistake he ever made. The year was 1991, and Dayanand was not a man who expected problems at his son's birthday party. He was one of Bangalore's most feared gangsters, the kind of man whose name settled arguments before they started. He had two sons. Bira, the elder, had his father's temperament, blunt, aggressive, and convinced that the family name was enough to protect him from consequences. The younger one was Bichu, and it was Bichu's birthday they were celebrating that evening. The party was lavish. A dance troupe had been brought in to perform. Among the performers was a young woman named Nadia, and the moment Bichu saw her, he stopped paying attention to anything else. What Bichu either didn't notice or didn't care about was that Nadia had come with someone, a fellow dancer named Ali. The two were together, and whatever Bichu thought that evening about what he was entitled to, Ali's view of the situation was entirely different. When Bichu approached Nadia and started harassing her, Ali intervened. The confrontation lasted seconds. Ali kicked Bichu hard enough that he went through a window. The drop killed him before he hit the ground. Ali and Nadia understood immediately what they had done, not in a moral sense, in a practical sense. They had killed the son of a man who made problems disappear for a living, and now they were the problem. They ran. Dayanand found out what happened, and gave his men one instruction: find them. Meanwhile, in a different part of the story entirely, a young actor named Shah Jahan was preparing for a film role. He had been cast as a hunter. He was the kind of actor who took preparation seriously, and playing a hunter convincingly meant understanding what hunters actually were. He had heard about the rifle club in Wayanad and decided to visit. On the way there, his phone rang. It was his cousin Ali, who said he needed to talk urgently. Shah Jahan's manager answered, told Ali that Shah Jahan was busy, and said he would call back later. He didn't call back. The rifle club had a history that most people in that part of Kerala knew only in fragments. It had been established during the British colonial era. When Tipu Sultan's forces drove the British out during their campaigns through the region, the British had locked their weapons in an underground vault beneath the property. After Tipu Sultan's reign ended, a group of Christian families took control of the land. Their descendants had been running the club ever since. Shah Jahan arrived and met Avaran, the club's secretary, the man who kept the place running. Avaran walked him through the armory with the unhurried manner of someone showing you something they genuinely loved. He explained that the collection beneath them contained antique British weapons, arms connected to Tipu Sultan's campaigns, and hunting rifles that had been in the families for generations. He said these things couldn't be owned in any real sense. They were inherited. You held them for a while and then passed them on. He showed Shah Jahan a massive cannon that the British had used to hunt elephants. He mentioned that every month, the club members cleaned it, oiled it, and polished it by hand. Then he introduced the members. Avaran's father, Lonapan, was one of the club's co-founders. He had been attacked by a wild boar years earlier, which had left his leg permanently damaged. He moved in a wheelchair now. It hadn't reduced his authority inside the club by any measurable amount. His daughter, Kunju Mole, was there with her husband. Avaran's wife, Cicely, was there, visibly pregnant. There was Punu, the contractor, and his wife Sasham, Advocate Koshi and his brother Father Joshi, and Tien Anam, daughter of one of the club's 3 original founders, who was known throughout the region for one specific quality: she never missed. Dr. Lazar, a physician, and Tien Anam's former husband, completed the main group. Every one of them had been hunting for decades. Firearms were not novelties to these people. They were a daily language. Then Ali arrived with Nadia. He found Shah Jahan and explained what had happened. Shah Jahan went to Avaran and said simply that his cousin had run into serious trouble and needed somewhere safe to stay for a while. Avaran said yes without asking for details. That evening, he took Shah Jahan and a few others out into the forest. There was a wild boar he had been tracking, and a night hunt under a full moon was exactly what it sounded like. While they were in the forest, a visitor arrived at the club. Bira had tracked Ali and Nadia to the rifle club. He pulled up to the entrance and found Tien Anam standing there. He looked at her and asked, in the manner of someone who had never had to revise his assumptions about people, whether there was a man around he could speak to. Anam pulled out her rifle, leveled it at him, and told him to assume she was the man. Then she asked what he wanted. Pira laughed. He walked away. He called his father and reported that Ali and Nadia were inside the club. He said it looked like a handful of old people, and asked permission to go in, finish them, and get out. Dayanand told him to wait until he arrived himself. He didn't want this rushed. Back in the forest, Avaran was teaching Shah Jahan how to shoot. He was explaining the patience that real hunting required, the way you read an animal's movement before it completes, the way a good hunter never pulls the trigger on instinct alone. At the club, Pira got tired of waiting. He walked in with a handful of men. They fired into the air. Pira had done versions of this before and understood the effect it produced in most situations. People panicked, people cooperated. The performance of violence was usually enough. Nobody in the rifle club panicked. Nobody flinched. The members looked at the men who had just fired automatic weapons into the air above their heads, and then they drew their own guns. The firefight that followed was not what Bira had prepared for. Several of his men were hit. Bira himself took injuries. Lonapan, sitting in his wheelchair, assessed the situation and made a decision. If Bira had come here, Dayanand was not far behind, and Dayanand would not come with a handful of men. He ordered someone to fire a flare into the sky to call Avaran back. In the forest, Avaran saw the flare. He looked at it for a moment and decided it had probably been fired by mistake. He went back to the hunt. Dayanand arrived at the club not long after. One of Pira's men who had survived told him what had happened. Dayanand looked at the result of his son's improvisation and shook his head. He had already lost one son. Now Pira had walked into a situation without understanding what he was walking into. Dr. Lazar was treating the wounded, including Pira. He worked without complaint, because that was what doctors did, even when the patient in front of them had just come to hurt the people around them. Bira regained consciousness and immediately pushed the doctor away. Refused treatment, refused everything. Dayanand came inside and announced, without weapons visible, that he only wanted to take his son home. He had even removed his outer clothing to show he wasn't carrying anything hidden. He said it plainly, unarmed, the gesture of a father trying to recover something before it got worse. Lazar went back to Pira and told him directly. The bleeding had to stop. If it didn't, the outcome was predictable. Pira refused to listen. He bled to death. Dayanand looked at his son's body. He didn't break down. He had his men carry Bira to a ravine and throw him in. Then he turned back toward the rifle club with both sons gone and a very clear idea of what he intended to do next. Inside the forest, Avaran found the body of his dog. Cicely had tied a note to the dog's collar and sent the animal to find him. The dog had come through the forest and found a tiger instead. Avaran crouched next to the animal for a moment. Then he untied the note from the collar and read it. He stood up. Everyone with him understood immediately that the pace of the evening had changed. They sent all the children away from the club first. Got them out through routes that Dayanand's men hadn't covered yet. Then the members of the rifle club settled in and waited. Dayanand's full assault came shortly after. The difference between the two sides was straightforward and significant. Dayanand's men had automatic and semi-automatic weapons. Modern, high capacity, capable of sustained fire. The club members had double-barreled shotguns that required reloading after every 2 shots. Weapons built for hunting animals in a forest, not for defending a building against a coordinated attack. And yet the club members were not behaving like people at a disadvantage. Dayanand had also positioned a sniper somewhere outside. The sniper was picking off defenders methodically, one injury at a time, keeping the pressure on and disrupting any attempt to organize a counterattack. Korjo, one of the members, went to Lenapan and said what the situation required. The underground vault. The British weapons. Tipu Sultan's arms. Whatever was in that collection, they needed it now. Without it, they were going to be overwhelmed. Lonapan didn't move. Korjo opened the vault. It was empty. He turned around and pointed a gun at Lonapan and asked where everything had gone. Lonapan explained it calmly. The authorities could inspect the club at any time. Keeping antique weapons that might not have proper documentation in an accessible vault was a risk he wasn't willing to take with pieces that belonged to his ancestors. He had moved everything. He said anyone who wanted those weapons would have to step over his body first. Korjo told him that everyone was going to die because of that decision. The argument was interrupted by the sound of Avaran arriving. He came in fast and didn't stop moving. He worked through the gangsters at the perimeter systematically, and within a short period, he had located and eliminated the sniper. The pressure on the defenders immediately changed. Then a motorcycle came through. One of Dayanand's men drove directly at the club entrance and smashed through it. The gunfire from the bike wounded both Avaran and Lonapan before the members could deal with the rider. Dayanand saw the opening and led the rest of his men in personally. He walked past the portraits of the club's founders and ancestors that lined the walls, and he stopped in front of them. He urinated in front of the portraits while his men watched. It was a deliberate act. Not impulsive. He wanted the people in that building to understand what he thought of their history and their legacy. It had the opposite of its intended effect. Inside the building, Shah Jahan, Ali, and Nadia had been hiding. When gangsters found their location, Shah Jahan and Ali fought. The same motorcycle rider who had crashed through the entrance came at the club members a second time and was caught with a large hook, restrained, and killed. And then the hunting began in earnest. The club members had spent decades learning to track, to wait, to read a situation before acting on it. They knew their building the way hunters know terrain they have worked for years. Every doorway, every corridor, every corner that offered cover or exposed you if you chose the wrong path through it. Dayanand's men were in unfamiliar space against people for whom it was entirely familiar. The members of the rifle club moved through their own building and took Dayanand's gang apart piece by piece. Not frantically, not desperately. With the deliberate patience of people who had been doing this their entire lives and understood that panic was what got you killed. They had simply adjusted what they were hunting. One by one, Dayanan's men stopped being a threat. Eventually Dayanan was the only one left. He still believed, standing in that building with his entire operation dismantled around him, that there was a path out. That if he kept moving and kept firing, he would find it. That the force of his reputation and his will was still a currency that could purchase survival. He walked into a room and found every remaining member of the rifle club standing in it, weapons raised, all of them pointing at him. He fired anyway, they fired back. He died in the same building where he had urinated in front of portraits of people who had been hunting in that valley since before his name meant anything to anyone. Dayanand had made a series of assumptions from the moment Bira called him that night. He had assumed that old people with old weapons were easy. He had assumed that people who lived quietly were people who couldn't cause damage. He had assumed that the club's restraint was the restraint of weakness, rather than the restraint of people who knew exactly what they were capable of and didn't feel the need to announce it. Every assumption was wrong, and the cost of each one added up. Bichu was gone because he treated a woman as something he was entitled to. Bira was gone because he walked into a room without understanding what was in it. Dayanand was gone because he drove to a club full of hunters and expected them to behave like prey. Ali and Nadia survived. Shah Jahan got a story he hadn't expected to come away with. The club members cleaned their weapons afterward the same way they cleaned them every month. Carefully, thoroughly, with the attention of people who understood that these things had been passed down to them and would need to be passed forward again. The rifle club stood in Wayanad the same way it had stood before any of this happened. The vault beneath it was empty because Lenapan had decided that some things were worth protecting even at cost. The portraits on the walls were still there. The cannon was still there. The people who had dismissed all of it as old and irrelevant were not. The message the film leaves behind is not complicated. It doesn't require a twist or a revelation. It only requires that you pay attention to what Dayanand failed to pay attention to. The most dangerous thing in any room is almost never the most visible one. He had walked into a club of hunters with an army of men and modern weapons, and the absolute certainty that the outcome was already decided. He was right about one thing. The outcome was already decided. He just had the wrong idea about which way it was going to go. And that is how a gangster who feared nothing drove to a hunting club in Wayanad and discovered, too late, that the old people with the old guns had been waiting their whole lives for something worth shooting at.